Today we're going to talk about Nikon autofocus and the one mode to rule them all. Stick around to find out. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Stu Clark here. Today we're going to talk about focus modes on Nikon cameras. So we're not going to be getting into the nitty gritty of the bird detect and all that. Today we're actually looking at some of the real basic setup, but even if you're a seasoned Nikon shooter, you may not have come across this setup. And once you see how I've utilized it, I have a funny feeling you'll also set your camera up this way as well. So what we're looking at today is focus modes. We're looking at manual focus, AFS, which is single focus mode, and then continuous focus mode in AFC. So manual, just like you think, you manually focus your lens. This is not a setting I typically would go out the house with. If you're a macro shooter, a landscape shooter, portraiture, things like that, you may use manual focus a little bit more. For myself as a wildlife photographer, I would never really use manual, like I said, going out the house. But manual override is really important in many situations that you're going to face with wildlife photography. You're shooting in low light. Some subjects, Nikon is known for, it can struggle with birds like herons and egrets and things like that. For whatever reason, long neck birds, the auto detect sometimes struggles to pick up the eye. In a cluttered, so you've got a cluttered foreground or background, knots on trees. There's things where the auto detect will sometimes get like a false positive. It'll look, the knot on a tree will look like an eye, so it'll go to that instead of the eye of your subject. And these are situations where having manual override can really help your photography and help you get the focus on your subject. Second will be a single focus, so AFS. This is one I never use. I never want it ever on my camera. In some situations, it is handy though. So that's where once we get into the settings and setup, I'm going to show you how you can access this without having to actually turn it on. The problem with AFS is the camera will focus on the subject, and then once it locks focus, it stays focused. Even if the subject moves, it stays focused on that spot. Say you're tracking a flying bird, for example. You lock focus, you're shooting away, shutter's going. You might not notice that the focus isn't changing and the entire series will be out of focus because basically you're only focused at the starting point. And so for me, it's a focus mode that I really do not like. And it would probably be great for maybe if you're working in portraiture, landscape photography. I sometimes use it for real estate photography, where you can kind of lock off on your subject and you know you're on a tripod and there's no movement at all. That would be great. You can just shoot in that mode. However, for shooting things like owls and things like that that aren't moving, it is nice where you can focus and you know that the focus won't be changing at all. So there is times where it's beneficial, but what we're going to show you with the settings with the Nikon camera, when you set it up correctly, you can actually access all three, manual, single, and continuous from one setting. No switches have to be changed, no dials have to be changed, nothing has to be changed, but you have access to all three of these focus modes in a roundabout way, and it works super well. So, and then finally AFC, and this is the mode that any wildlife photographer is going to be using all 98, 99% of the time, which is when you're holding down the focus button, the camera's continuously focusing. It's continuously trying to find your subject, whether it be on the eye. Instead, with the new focus modes in these cameras, with bird detect and animal detect, they're amazing. They're not perfect though, and that's why I like to have the camera set up the way we're going to discuss. So all three of these focus modes, manual, single, and continuous, all play a part in wildlife photography. They'll play a part in all photography, but they all definitely play a part in wildlife photography, and that's going to be the focus of this discussion today. You can, if it works, if you're in a different discipline, if you're in landscape or architecture, this a lot of the points will still make sense, and you might want to adopt some of these settings for yourself. But for wildlife, I find this is, for me, I think this is kind of the brilliance of Nikon engineering and how they've designed these cameras. Going back, I believe in my old D70, you could set this up this way. So, so this is the D500, Z8 there. They all have the same options for setting this up. So first off, we're going to look at is going to be the AF on button. So AF on button is a key part of this. And how the AF on button works is you use your thumb to focus instead of a half press on the shutter button. So basically what we do when we go into the setting here, what we're doing is we are telling the camera to disable the shutter button, half press as a focus option, and only focuses with the thumb. So basically taking the photo on the front and the focus on the back. And by separating those two functions from the shutter button, it really adds a ton of versatility and really kind of allows you to take full control of the camera in any situation without having to switch modes. And that's why I highly recommend it. A lot of some people will say that they struggle to get used to the back button focus, and I get that in some situations. You know, if you've been so used to shooting a shutter button as your focus, it can take a little bit of training. But I do think that if you stick with it, it's probably a week, maybe two max. You'll get comfortable with it, and it's so useful as a tool in the field. I would highly, highly encourage you to try and get comfortable with it and kind of adopt this setup. So what we're going to do, you basically go on to into the menu. We're going to go to under the photo shooting menu. So this is photography based, not videography based, especially with the Nikon Z8. Because you're going to be using AFF, you've got another option for focus modes in video. So we're not going to touch on video today. It's going to be strictly a photography setup. So we're going to start in the photo shooting menu. We're going to go down to focus mode. We're going to want to make sure it is on AFC. We're now going to go down to custom settings menu. We go to focus. So we are going down to, so we're going to make sure that on AFC priority selection, we are set on release. That way it takes a photograph when you press the button. We're going to go down to AF activation. And we're going to make sure that we put this on AF on only. And you want to make sure that you have autofocus release enabled. So this is very, very important to make sure you have that. I believe it is by default is on enable. And that just means when you press the button, it takes a photograph. It's not waiting for the camera to get in focus. Very important. So what this means is that when you switch it to AF on only, you've disabled the focusing from the shutter. The shutter only takes the photo. When we enable autofocus release, that means the camera will take the photo even if it thinks it's not fully in focus. And this one's really important. You get a flyover, and sometimes the camera might not be fully locked on the eye, but it's so close, the shot will be in focus to your eye. So you want to make sure the camera just takes a photo. It's really important with AFC. You just want the camera taking photo. You never want it to hang until it thinks it's fully locked on. You'll miss far too many photos. If you're shooting an AFS, that would be a feature you sometimes want where you're dealing with a static subject. And again, that's a different kind of genre of photography than we're talking today. And now we're going to go down to focus mode restrictions. And what we're going to do here is we're going to set it to continuous AF. We never want this camera going to single AF or manual focus because we're going to have access to it the way we set it up. We're going to go down to focus mode restrictions. And this one, we're basically going to eliminate everything but AFC. And you're going to say, well, Stu, didn't you just say we're going to have access to all three? And yes, you will. And that's what we're going to talk about. But for this setting here, we want to make sure that AFS cannot mistakenly get put on. We want to make sure it doesn't get put into manual mode by mistake. Basically, AFC is the only focus mode we want active for wildlife photography. Very important. And again, this is in the shooting menu bank, not in the video menu bank. This is a photography-based setting. So now that we've got that set up, what does it mean and how does it apply to our photography? So when you're shooting, with the AF on button, it's, like I say, it really becomes second nature. Once you get used to it, once you get your head wrapped around it, it's just part of photography now for me. When I pick up my camera, my thumb fits in place and I'm automatically focusing right away. And it's really simple. You really get used to it. So with AFC, you hold the button down and then you're taking photos. And as you're holding your thumb down, the camera is constantly focusing. And that's ideally what you want. You know, you've got moving subjects, you're shooting away, you want your camera continuously focusing. You don't want it hanging up, you don't want it getting stuck there. It's always looking to focus underneath the focus point. And if you're going to be, like I said, if you're in bird detect, other things come into play a little bit there. But for what we're talking about here, this, like I said, with focus, we're just looking at the focus modes here. So AFC, push the button, press the trigger, you should be focused. But that's not always the case, as we know, because of those other variables coming in. Low light situations, depending on your lens. If you're dealing with a slower lens, you might struggle in really low light conditions. If you're not shooting on a Z8, you're shooting on a Z30, it's definitely not going to be as accurate a focusing camera as a Z8. So in some situations, you are going to struggle with it. Nikon, with their AFS and with their Z mirrorless lenses, if you go back to the old AFD, the older lenses, the gear-driven ones, this does not apply to those lenses as much. You do have to switch them into manual mode, a lot of them. But when you're dealing with anything in the last, 15 years, any lenses released in the last 15 years, it will apply to that. So what Nikon is pretty brilliant is that, you know, you've got manual and automatic mode and you've got manual mode on the lens. With Nikon, you don't have to switch anything. And basically you can be shooting away in autofocus mode and you can just manually focus. It's got a manual focus override that you just turn the lens and focus. It's wonderful. So how this is great, there's certain situations where if your lens gets lost, you know, you've got a bird flying and it will all of a sudden track with a mountain backdrop or something, and your focus might pull to the background and you're struggling to get it off the mountain. A quick thumb rack of the focus will quickly draw the focus in front of your subject, that the autofocus then often finds your subject on the way back out. You can quickly manually override it, no problem as well. And that's something that Nikon's done a great job of that. That's great. So then, like I said, so with AFC enabled, with the back button, you can just manually focus, no problem. The other nice feature now with focus peaking in the Z8, if you're focusing, you lose your subject. If you keep holding the focus button down and start manually focusing, you actually get focus peaking will show through the viewfinder. If you're not holding down the AF on button, it won't show the focus peaking. You do have to hold it down in photo mode and video mode, it will show. So what's great is you're trying to shoot, your subject gets lost in the background, lost in the foreground. Keep holding down that AF on button and start manually focusing. The manual focus will override the AF on. So your camera will no longer autofocus until you take the thumb off the button and press it again, and then autofocus will engage again. So when you're dealing with manual mode, this camera is just awesome. That if I focus on the subject, so I've got the eye focus there, you can see how it's not wanting to. It's for some reason it's picking up the face there, not the eye. That's an example of when you start dealing with, so it might be pulling focus a little bit forward in this situation. So this is where, so you'd see it might be focused on the nose. And this is a great example of where the manual focus override comes in. So with manual focus, I just start to focus manually. You can see how the peaking, the red comes into play. And that's where that tells you where the camera is actually focusing. So this would be a good example where you can see the wood in the background starts to come into focus here, and then forward as you're focusing forward. It works super well. And as long as I've engaged the AF on button, the focus peaking will show. Take my thumb off and you can still manually focus, but you don't get the peaking without the AF on button being engaged. I press the AF on button and autofocus immediately re-engages. So if you look at the top there, you'll see how manual focus, as soon as I touch the dial, the MF comes up, thumb on and off, I'm immediately back to AF AFC. So it's a really quick, it said no switches, nothing has to be changed, just you simply could manually override as needed, back to autofocus. And it's a super quick way of getting back onto your subject if the camera gets lost in your subject. With the focus peaking, you can then start following in and out on your subject by holding down that AF on button. And then as soon as it's in focus, you can shoot away. At that point, you can probably, once you've gained focus manually, you can probably engage the autofocus and it will stay locked on at that point because the camera knows where it's looking for the subject. So that's kind of a great way, kind of a really quick, easy way. Manual override works phenomenally well. Use it, things like warblers, things like that, things where fast-moving subjects and cluttered foregrounds and backgrounds is one area. You might just have to do a quick manual override to pull the focus forward or backward, depending on how your subject is against the background. With the Z8, I rarely have to do it. If you're using a less expensive camera, you might find you have to do it a bit more. The autofocus is just not as accurate as the high-end cameras. And it's a really great trick to know that you can just, by having it set up that way, you just manually override it. As soon as you're locked on, you can just kind of re-engage the autofocus. As the subject moves, just take your thumb off and on, and you're engaged again. And that's kind of a great way to kind of assist the camera in difficult focusing situations. The AFS mode, as I said, is one that I despise when the camera gets turned on. And I find where it used to be, if I'm going out and I do landscape photography, more often than not, it's if I'm shooting test charts for making videos or if I'm kind of testing my gear to see how sharp it is, how the lenses and camera are working properly. That's one where that's one of the few times I actually put AFS actually turn AFS on. So AFS, it will lock focus and it stays there until you take your thumb off the button and re-engage it again. So once it focuses, it locks. It will not change focus while you're holding the AF on button down. If you take your thumb off, move it, and then re-engage it, it will refocus at that point. How this now gets utilized with the AF on button is in reverse. So instead of focusing and locking, you focus and just take your thumb off the button. Once you take your thumb off the button, the camera stops focusing. You can shoot away and the focus is not being engaged. That's one of the awesome features of using the AF on button. A good example of this would be composition, and especially back, like I said, the D500 days where it didn't have subject tracking or subject detect or 3D tracking, or the area AF was less than accurate, we'll say. So with this camera, how I used to shoot was center point. I would focus on the subject and then I'd recompose. Focus on my subject and then I can recompose as needed, and the focus doesn't change by just taking your thumb off of the AF on button. So you effectively have got the AFS single focus mode just by stopping the camera focusing by taking your thumb off the button. So super useful and it's really handy to have. And you know, the slight change to kind of put the subject on the third line would not generally affect the focus. You're dealing with a minuscule amount. You got an owl sitting on a branch and you wanted to just kind of change the composition. You didn't want your subject centered. You could just recompose in the camera simply by taking your thumb off of the AF on button. So you basically shoot, you'd focus center on the subject eye. On the tripod, you just shift it off center and shoot away. By taking your thumb off, the focus is not changing. So basically, that's giving you your single, your AFS. It's focusing on your subject. You disengage the autofocus by taking your thumb off the button instead of the camera disengaging it by saying it's focused. So it's kind of, effectively works the same, and it's a simple technique that works really well. So this one, like I said, the biggest one for this, owls in low light, especially with the newer cameras. I was photographing saw-whet owls in the springtime, and I was using the teleconverter. So the camera was struggling. It was 6400 ISO, low light conditions, kind of late in the evening. And when using a teleconverter, I'm using an F-mounted adapted 200 to 500 with a teleconverter. Less than ideal situation for autofocus for sure. So that's a situation where you can manually focus with the center point. The 3D track, the 3D or the auto area would really struggle to get the eye of the bird, especially if they're blinking or they're sleeping. The camera would be jumping on and off. So that'd be a situation where you focus on the eye, you disengage the autofocus, and then you can just recompose and shoot. And it works super well. And if I had this focus still on the shutter button, every time you go to take a photograph, the camera's going to be trying to refocus again. And you're going to end up with it missing a bunch of shots. Likewise, with the manual mode, with the Z8, you can actually, when you start manually focusing, you can zoom in on your subject to make sure that you're zoomed right in on the eye, manually focus, and you can shoot away. And by not having the autofocus engaged on your shutter button, you're not having the focus drift on you. You know it's exactly where you manually focused. You zoomed right in. You know it's absolutely accurate. But if the owl moves, one button, you're autofocusing again. And that's where this is great. You're getting manual mode with a manual override. Push the button, autofocus is re-engaged. Single subject, take your thumb off. You've stopped the camera from focusing. You can recompose. And then any movement, any change of subject, you've got a jay flies in to harass that owl and you want to quickly get the jay, you can immediately, you're re-engaged with autofocus. You're not having to switch back in the day, you used to have to switch the mode on the front of the camera to go to manual mode. On the lens itself, you don't have to switch it. It's just basically everything works just by simply having the AF on button engaged, and then eliminating those other two options, eliminating manual and single from in camera. So AFC is the only focus mode that as soon as you press this button and hold it down, AFC, so continuous focus mode, is engaged. You take it off, it's single shot, it's focused where you let go, and manually override, and you manually override. And that's kind of an amazing way to shoot these cameras for wildlife that if you haven't set your camera up this way, I highly encourage you to give it a go. And you'll really appreciate the versatility of it and the speed of it. And hopefully you miss far fewer subjects. And yeah, that's kind of today's tip. If you got some good info out of this, please like and subscribe. Help me grow this channel. And until next time, we'll see you out there. Take care.